Hi everyone. With this video, I'd like to delve a little bit more into David Gordon Green's Halloween from 2018, which just released this last weekend. So it's doing fairly well, and as it just so happens, I really enjoyed the film. Click on the link below to find out what I thought about the film. I guess I could summarize really quickly and say that I liked it, but in that video where I talk about these things, more generally and without spoilers, these videos will be more aimed at a discussion where I want to go more in depth about individual things, and I thought it might be more ergonomic to cover them one topic at a time per video, just so that these videos don't get overlong. I will be going in depth and there will be spoilers, but I'll only be talking about one topic per video, just to kind of shorten things. With this video, I'll be talking about doubles. Doubles are actually a very common theme in horror films. Not just horror, you can see it in fantasy, in science fiction, and because the Gothic is a mode, it doesn't really fall neatly into one genre. So you can have Gothic fantasy, you can have Gothic science fiction, and you can have science fiction or fantasy that isn't Gothic, and still feature certain devices, I think, in terms of, say, science fiction with posthumanism, where you're dealing with Data from Star Trek The Next Generation, where you could argue that he's sort of a double of sorts, but science fiction would stress the fact that he's not human at all. He was never human, and that quality is meant to show how he isn't human, despite the fact that he looks human. Whereas a double in a Gothic story will emphasize qualities of us in the monster, or the fact that the monstrous behavior of someone, that dark double or copy, that they are exhibiting things present in ourselves that we would pass off onto the monster to avoid confronting. The monster, no matter how horrible it is, no matter how awful, is always connected to the space, but it's always connected to us moving through the space as well, and that we're doomed to be forced to confront and possibly even inherit these qualities just by being inside the haunted house or the town, wherever, whatever property or residence that's afflicted with this continual problem. We must face the dark secrets inside that property. So, without further ado, doubles. How do they fit into Halloween? It's not just the most recent film, of course, but doubles go all the way back to the original Halloween. So before I get into that, I just want to summarize the ending of Halloween 2018, which isn't what I thought it would be in the trailer. And before I continue, there will be spoilers, so if you haven't seen the movie yet and you don't want to be spoiled, you may as well stop watching now. With that being said, the final act of Halloween takes place at Laurie's house, which we learn it's a trap for Michael. And there's a great deal of foreshadowing leading up to this. And the evil doctor describes that these two characters are not set in their behaviors, and that one is afraid of becoming the prey versus one being afraid of being the hunter, and that their roles are not fixed, and that they can kind of fluctuate back and forth, and that one will hunt and attack the other, and vice versa, in an attempt to stay alive. You put them both in the same space, they begin to mobilize. Laurie Strode has been waiting 40 years, essentially dormant, for Michael to return, and she's expecting him to return. And until that point, she's effectively ostracized. She's a pariah in her own town. Michael is the same way. Even in the madhouse, he's quiet. He doesn't say anything. And this is something that they emphasize in the film. Say something. It starts at the beginning of the movie, and then, of course, when the doctor is killed, Michael refuses to speak. He's a being of pure action. And yet his action is galvanized by the presence of his double, Laurie, his foil, good versus evil, except in a Gothic tale, the qualities of each of these characters will overlap. Laurie is supposed to be the prey, and yet we realize through the reversal of their roles in this film towards the end, when he is trapped in the house and left to die while the women escape. And all of the shots that they have in the film, which in the 1978 version would have been Michael in the shot, instead Laurie is in the shot. So when her granddaughter is in the classroom, the teacher is giving the lecture and she's bored just like Laurie was, and she looks out the window. She doesn't see Michael. She sees Laurie. These are very intentional, suggesting that Laurie is effectively the shape in this scenario. Now, it doesn't have to be quite so literal in the way that you're thinking. It's not black and white. Just because she looks out the window and sees her grandmother as this kind of ghost or this shape doesn't mean that there's a one-to-one sort of replication. She's not a perfect copy of Michael. It's meant to be ambiguous more than a complete reversal. That's how doubles work. And it's meant to make your imagination kind of go and think that there may be certain things about this character that are not what you would want them to be. Laurie is supposed to be the hero, and yet here she is standing the exact same way that Michael was. And you have to keep in mind, in the original 1978 version of this scene, when Laurie is looking out the window and she sees Michael, the teacher in the background is describing fate as personified, as something that never changes. There's an implacable, irresistible quality to it. And when Michael in this film is standing outside of the classroom, he is fate personified, and not just in that scene, but through the whole film. And that if you look out the window and you see Laurie standing outside the window, she is fate personified. But fate is more than just a killing machine. It's not simply Michael, but it's Michael and Laurie. Two doubles that are both fate personified, and that you can take both characters and reverse the roles and still have the same sort of predicament where you have good, evil, prey, hunter, and you can kind of reverse those around in the same space and still have the same kind of contrast, if you will, in a way that is ambiguous. Michael, as a character, is ambiguous. He's a shape. He's not concrete. He has no defining features. If you look at him, he's doll-like. Obviously, you could make the argument that he's a guy in a jumpsuit, a blue tracksuit with a Michael Shatner mask, and these are very concrete qualities. But if you're looking at him at a glance, there's a sort of periodic quality to it where you really can't make out anything about him. And Laurie, when you look at her in these situations, you'll become similarly confused in regards to what is she? What is this presentation suggesting through her being in these positions that would have been originally occupied by Michael? It doesn't have to be literal. It doesn't have to be the monster in this situation, but she is monstrous. She is a being of violence, even if that violence is predicated on self-defense versus rote mechanical destruction, like it is with Michael. Oftentimes in these stories, the hero will have to face the other, which is indicative of qualities within themselves. So Laurie, in 1978, is sexually frustrated. There are things in that film which would lead just about anyone, I suggest, to feel frustrated. Laurie wants to go out with Ben Tramer, and yet she's deathly afraid of that. And the other girls seem to have no problem at all meeting boys, getting laid, having fun. And there's a certain amount of resentment to that. Laurie isn't a perfect Girl Scout. She has feelings of sexual desire. She doesn't necessarily want to be pigeonholed into that goody girl sort of role. But that's ultimately what ends up happening, is that all of the responsibilities of parenting and good behavior are foisted on her, and the other girls get to have all the fun on Halloween. On Halloween, the other girls are the ones who are killed. Not because sex is bad. Let's forget that argument. This isn't a sense of morals. It's merely a sense of what someone wants. And in this case, Laurie wants the things that she doesn't have. A boyfriend, an ability to sort of cut loose and not have to be stuck with all of the responsibilities, to have the power to have fun on the one night where it seems like everyone can do whatever the hell they want, except Laurie. And in this situation, these other characters are killed by someone who is blank, who has no personality themselves. They're a killing machine, but they're also a double. Someone who kills the characters that Laurie has a chip on her shoulder concerning. In that situation, Laurie is not literally explaining to Michael, I want you to go and kill these people for me because I am sexually frustrated. Doubles don't necessarily work like that, and yet it's meant to invoke a feeling of contrast between these characters. Laurie is sexually frustrated. The other girls are not. Michael, this character who doesn't represent anything at all except the other, he is the boogeyman. The boogeyman is an embodiment of murder, of death, as something cyclical that returns to a space. He has no definite shape. There is a potential for you to be able to say that Michael represents the sexual frustrations of Laurie Strode in that film. It's symbolic. It's a metaphor. It's a comparison between two seemingly unlike things. And yet Michael isn't so different from Laurie that you could easily say that they're nothing alike at all. Because, again, Laurie Strode is perfectly good, right? Perfectly normal, would never do anything violent. And yet in that film she does when she is forced to confront a side of herself that she doesn't want to face. The fact that this killer is going around and murdering these people for seemingly no reason, or for reasons that would be described as, say, petty. If it's he doesn't like them having sex, you could say that's a pretty shallow reason to go around and commit murder, in the same sense that Laurie Strode is perhaps being unreasonable in her resentment of these characters, and yet she resents them all the same in ways that we can understand. So even if it's not her actually committing these murders, there is a parallel between her feelings of frustration and the actual murders being carried out by the individual that's meant to sort of symbolize frustration and murderous tendencies in general. Even if it's not actually her, she can look at that and see mirrored in that person herself, or a side of herself, and at the end of Halloween she has to face that individual by being violent, by stabbing him in the throat and the eye and the chest, effectively fighting fire with fire. And that in and of itself is traumatic. It's not just meeting him and quaking in fear, in terror, when she's in the haunted house and she sees that Annie and Linda and Bob are dead, and she is afraid at that point. Or when she sees Michael and she's quivering in fear. That's a particular type of reaction. But that being forced to violently fight back is in and of itself traumatic. You think that it would be empowering, but it's also forcing her to reach deep down inside her to effectively draw upon a darker side of herself that she wouldn't normally use in this situation. You'll notice that in the original Halloween, violence isn't the first reaction of Laurie Strode. Her first reaction is to scream and run away, to cry out for help. And she's basically running around at this point, trying to get away from the monster. And when she's running away from that monster, she's not just running away from Michael the man. She's also running away from her own violent reaction that she has to sort of summon up to defeat this thing. You have to become a monster to defeat a monster. Does that mean that she has become Michael Myers? No, but she has become something that Michael Myers represents in all of us. That's the point of a double. And that the ambiguity in that summoning is the fact that this violence is similar enough to the violence that Michael embodies that you can't say that they're completely different from each other. You can say one is in self-defense and one is purely for the sake of it, and yet you can't identify why Michael does what he does, so you can't make a negative claim against him and Laurie being alike. You can't say, well, he's not like Laurie because Laurie is fighting in self-defense. But what if Michael is fighting in self-defense? You don't know because you can't say why he kills. he goes around and kills people, but perhaps he feels threatened. And if he feels threatened, how is his reaction that different from Laurie Strode? It's all about perspective. It's all about point of view. It would be very easy to say he's going around and killing innocent, defenseless children. And yet the children aren't wholly innocent because they're getting into trouble. And I'm not advocating murder here. I'm just saying that appearances aren't quite what they seem because the children are up to no good, and Laurie Strode herself isn't as innocent as she seems. And I'm not saying that, well, because of that, it's an automatic death sentence. I'm merely saying that appearances aren't to be trusted in these situations, and that when you're pitted up against, say, a double, something that confuses things rather than clears things up, it only causes things to become even more convoluted or confusing. And that's the whole point. There isn't a sense of resolution at the end in 1978, because when Michael is seemingly dealt with, he remains. He disappears. But Laurie does not. And after she has been traumatized from having to confront Michael, but also because she's had to fight back, she's had to spring into action to become violent. And this is something that's explored in Halloween 2018. But the sense of doubling isn't just with Laurie and the Shape, where you have the rules reversed. It's also the Doctor. And she says of the new Doctor, whose name I can't remember, "You're the new Loomis." And yet the Doctor in this film and Dr. Loomis are quite different from each other, but it's not something that's as immediately obvious because they both are very solicitous of Michael for different reasons. They watch over him, and yet the reasons that they do so are different from each other, and yet the true motives of the Doctor in this film aren't revealed right away. So despite being the next Loomis and having similar qualities to him, they are not the same person. Just as Laurie and Michael are not the same person, despite having similar qualities, despite being in the same environment and kind of rotating back and forth between prey and hunter, a cycle between the two of them, but also across generations with the next in line, with Laurie's daughter, who was taught to defend herself against violence in the same way that Laurie had to learn the hard way. She was taught before even meeting Michael. She didn't believe it was real. And you're not even sure if she's capable of it, and she isn't sure if she's capable of it. And at the end of the film, you're left doubting when she says in the basement, "I can't do it." And then Michael steps into the frame, and then she reveals her true motives. Up until she does that, you're not sure if she has it in her to be violent. Just as if you look at Michael, you're not sure if he has it in him to be prey. There's always a sense of doubt, of ambiguity with two or more characters relating to each other within a space. But the space is property that's owned by, say, Laurie or her kin, and it's being sort of contested or under attack by Michael. So the space sort of contains all of them, and it represents them. This is something that's personified in the film with the doll sequence where they have the dark rooms, and you're going from room to room. Laurie is the point of view in this situation, and there are dolls everywhere, and that Michael sort of represents one of those doll figures straight out of The Duchess of Malfi, where the Duchess is confronted by Ferdinand in a dark room and says, "Behold your family." In that situation, wax sculptures are presented to the Duchess, wherein she can't quite tell what she's looking at because the room is so dark. She can only see shapes, a humanoid kind of shape. It's the same idea as Michael Myers. The double for the mannequins is just sort of a visual gag, whereas in Michael's case, the mannequin has sort of come to life. When he puts on the mask, he effectively becomes sort of a mannequin in motion, sort of an effigy, something out of the past that comes alive, an emblem of evil, if you will. No different than a suit of armor. If a suit of armor in a castle were confronted, you would be seeing something worn by an individual that has come to life, but furthermore represents acts of violence in the past that are passed down that you can confront merely by moving through a space. Michael is no different. He is, as a man, nothing. What you see as moving around are clothing. The only thing of his that is of flesh and blood are his hands, but apart from that, he's a jumpsuit. He's a mask with no eyes behind it. He's effectively a suit of armor, or a doll, something inanimate that has come to life to plague the present out of the past, a past crime that's brought forward, and that's something that you have to face as the proprietor of a property in the present. This space is full of darkness and death and things that represent potentially actions that I might myself execute that would indicate that I'm more like this thing that I'm afraid of than I care to admit. And it doesn't have to be a one-to-one correspondence. If you have a reversal, it doesn't necessarily mean that even though you're behaving like the hunter for a moment, that you're exactly like how Michael was in that situation. That's not how doubles work. And I enjoyed the ending because it was a continuation of certain things that we saw earlier when Laurie is looking at her granddaughter in the classroom and she's standing where Michael stood. Well, at the end of the film in the haunted house, when Michael is tricked by Laurie's daughter and shot, he moves out of the frame and we see a doorway filled with darkness, and there is Laurie's face. She's been watching, lurking, very similar to Michael. And it's a little bit alarming. And of course, in this scene, the predicament is unique in that it's not exactly the same that it was in 1978, but there's a certain amount of ambiguity. In this moment, Laurie is behaving like the killer, not to the point that you can say that she has become him the way that he is this remorseless killing machine, but there is a parallel and there is a certain level of ambiguity. It doesn't have to be exact, but it's present. There's a conclusion of sorts that is unresolved, just like in 1978. In David Gordon Green's film, the house is burning down and Michael is trapped in the basement while everything burns around him. And the three women run away, flag down a pickup truck, and climb in the bed. The driver takes off, and it concludes with the camera looking at the three women, but then eventually focusing on the knife, the bloody kitchen knife, clutched in the fingers of the granddaughter. And I thought that this was interesting because you have to keep in mind that in this situation, the granddaughter has a more passive role. She's the object of protection, similar to Tommy in Halloween or Newt in Aliens. That's going on in a way that is idiosyncratic to this film. It's not exactly the same because, unlike Newt or Tommy, the granddaughter does fight back at the end, but largely as a defensive measure. She's not engaging with Michael as actively as the mother or the grandmother is, but it is educational for her. This entire sequence is something that teaches her a life lesson. How does one have to respond to survive when confronting this violent part of everyday life? And you might say, well, it's not of everyday life, but it's something within the space. It's the boogeyman of Haddonfield. It's the mannequin in the haunted house that if you stand around long enough, if you wander the halls long enough, it will come alive out of the darkness and kill you. And yet the horrifying thing is, it's a part of the space that you can actually bump into. And that these boundaries get kind of confused because of the darkness, but also the uncertainty of the roles and the passage of time as sort of confusing things. And that you have these characters whose roles are constantly swimming in this mess of action across a space that is confusing. So, at the end of the film, the granddaughter is clutching the knife, and I found myself thinking of Jamie from Halloween 4, and that in that film, the conclusion was not left to our imagination. There was a lot of obvious foreshadowing, and at the end of the film, she realizes her role as the next killer. And you have to keep that in mind. Laurie Strode is a killer. The mother is a killer, and they have realized at the end of the film a violent potential, or a potential for violence within themselves. The circumstances are different, but it is in confrontation with something that is similarly violent for its own reasons, that mirror theirs, in a way that can't be excluded or extricated from each other. Same idea with the granddaughter, in that the granddaughter has just been through a rite of passage, wherein she has been taught that in order to defeat this presence within a space, one must be violent, and that at the end of the film there is no resolution to that. Michael disappears. We do not see his burning corpse. All we see are the three women huddled together. There is no telling how the granddaughter will take this lesson. They're merely holding the knife, in the same sense that if Michael were holding the knife, you would have to ask yourself, how does this end? It doesn't end, and that's the point. It didn't end in 1978 because Michael came back more than once. 10 years later, 20 years later, 40 years later. Even if they're on separate timelines and he doesn't return, you'll notice that there are echoes of these sequels that never happened in David Gordon Green's film, and that there is a sense of continuation and a sense of potential return in a way that you could describe as purely imaginative in nature. If you were in this situation and you thought, have I seen this person before? Or has this all happened before? Out of the past into the present, even if it's on separate timelines, you're confronting time itself in all of its actualities and its potential realities that never came to be. That's what happens when you confront Michael Myers, when you confront the alien or the other, that side of yourself that may or may not come to pass. And if it does come to pass, it may or may not be what you think it is, relative to yourself and relative to the thing that you're facing. It's ambiguous, but it's there, or the potential for it to resurface is there, and you can't say exactly what will happen, what you're looking at, what you are, but you're affected nonetheless. And at the end of Halloween 2018, the granddaughter has been affected, and Michael vanishes into the darkness, with the threat that he will return again. But will he return? Or will the evil, or the darkness, or the other that he personifies reemerge in the granddaughter, who has her own frustrations in that she has been wronged, that her boyfriend, the leading source of her frustration, nothing ever happens to him, which suggests that there is an unresolved sort of frustration that may return later to continually frustrate the granddaughter to the extent that she may lash out or that Michael may return. There's a potential for the killer to resurface, but also for the object that incites that return to influence further cycles of violence. But furthermore, in regards to the doubling of Laurie and Michael in the first film, and how Michael is representative of Laurie's own frustrations in regards to the sexual conquests of her friends, Annie, Linda, Bob. In Halloween 2018, you'll notice that there is one scene in particular where the granddaughter has just been disappointed by her boyfriend. The friend of the boyfriend decides to walk her home, and at first he seems innocuous, but then he decides to make a move. He was off in his predictions about how things would go if he actually made a pass, because she tells him flat out, I'm not interested in you. And that right after that, she leaves, and who emerges but the shape, who kills this individual. Now, I'm not suggesting that Michael and the granddaughter are working together. There's no conspiracy here, but that Michael's violence against the boyfriend represents her angst towards this individual for making an unwanted sexual pass towards her. And it doesn't have to be a direct sort of cause and effect, but merely something that you can infer through proximity. She leaves. Michael enters. What does Michael's violence represent? His own desire to kill, surely, but also hidden desires within the granddaughter towards this individual. God, why did he make a pass at me? I could just kill him. When she leaves, the shape enters and carries out her wish, even if it's an unfulfilled wish, even if it's a secret wish, and furthermore, a wish that when confronted with, she would be horrified by, something that she's not necessarily aware of. So when she hears the scream, she turns around to find that boy's murdered body she's horrified by. Oh my God, I just secretly wished that he might meet this kind of fate. Even if it's just a passing thought, even if you're not fully aware of it, she might later think to herself, I wished him dead, and he died. How horrifying, the fact that he's dead, but also that I wished it, and it came true. And that faced with Michael Myers, she runs away screaming, just like Laurie Strode did. And you'll notice that it's not just between Laurie and Michael, and that when staring at Michael, other characters in the story either don't believe in his existence, that he's not a part of Haddonfield, or that he's not a part of their lives, or that they are unlike him. He's a killing machine. He's totally alien to where they live, but also who they are as people, as a part of this world of Haddonfield, this small town. He's not of them. He's something that you banish or chase away. And yet on Halloween, the membrane between the world that you know and the world that is just around the corner, that represents everything that you don't want to face, the membrane between those two is at its thinnest, and that you're forced to confront the very thing that you would hope to exorcise or chase away. In order to banish it, you have to get close to it. You can't just point a stick at it from a distance and say abracadabra and hope that it will go away. There is always a condition of proximity with the thing that you want to banish. And that's what happens with the granddaughter. And not only is she close to Michael in this film in a way where he represents a side of her that she might not care to face, but also she's close to her grandmother, a part of the family that is effectively banished. She's not supposed to be talking to her grandmother. They are at odds. There is a tension between grandmother and mother in regards to the nature of violence, and that the grandmother is seen as monstrous by the mother, and that her childhood was effectively hell on earth because of this presence of the boogeyman that the mother never saw. For her, the boogeyman wasn't Michael Myers. It was her mother. Now you could say, well, Michael Myers was real and she knew that, but she never met him. He was just a legend. Whereas for her, the reality of what the boogeyman would be was Laurie Strode, who made her life a living hell. Now obviously later on, these skills come in handy when she's able to fight back. But in doing so, she has to face a side of herself that is horrifying. Because earlier on in the film, she says, there is no darkness, there is no evil. The world is just full of love and hope. That's obviously not true. And the point of that scene is that she's rejecting not only Michael Myers, but a side of herself. When inside this house, she is forced to summon up a violent destroyer to defeat a violent destroyer. There is a constant relationship between who you think you are and who you are in a way that you don't necessarily want to face, even if the mirror that shows you that side of yourself isn't you, but someone else. But that someone else, that instructor, is a part of the space in a way that people might want to forget, or say it's just a legend, it's not real, he's just a man. But the relationship between you and that person is much more difficult to eradicate than that. He comes back, and if he doesn't come back literally, he comes back merely by walking through a room and seeing a mannequin, and you start to impose upon that mannequin or that shape the possibility that it might come to life and kill you. And in that moment of fear, a part of you that you don't wish to confront rises up to meet that challenge, a challenge that by and large was the results of an overstimulated imagination. And there's all of this stuff going on where you have legend and reality and imagination and danger that is brought out through the tension of doubles, Loomis, the doctor, Laurie Strode, the mother, the granddaughter, so it's a cycle. Michael Myers pitted against all of them, but also of the space, where you have the space, you have Michael Myers. Michael Myers is Haddonfield as much as Laurie Strode and the other women are of Haddonfield. They're all crammed into the same space together. They are all sort of embroiled with this tension between values and symbols and what they represent in a way that is terrifying and horrifying, and there's always a threat of violence returning, and not from where you might think, because the doctor is a source of violence that you might not expect, and that you are sort of influenced in such a way that you might let down your guard because he's the next Loomis. But is he the next Loomis? And it turns out that you would be mistaken in thinking that, and if you were wrong about that, who else might you be wrong about? Are we wrong about the daughter? How would she respond in this situation? Do people always become good after being in close proximity with the presence of a destroyer? The doctor spent most of his life studying and reading Michael Myers, and that gazing into the abyss, it gazed into him, and it changed him. But perhaps he was always like that, and if he was always like that, it took a catalyst to bring out those qualities. He, and by extension us, didn't know that those qualities existed inside him until the moment of violence confirmed it, and that with the granddaughter, that moment of confirmation has not yet come to pass. She's holding the knife at the end of the film, and a future moment of violence or frustration might cause her to act out violently in a way that isn't what we expect. She has yet to confront that part of her that could surprise us in the same way that Laurie Strode had yet to confront that part of her that was constantly changing. The Laurie Strode that we saw in 1978 was not the same person that we saw 40 years later, and the mother that we saw 40 years later in flashbacks was a scared child who saw her training as pointless. Not until that moment of action were we able to sort of realize that she had passed the test. The granddaughter has yet to meet that challenge. She's effectively not center stage in this current predicament, and that because Michael vanishes and could return again in a different form, it wouldn't even have to be him. Very easily, the granddaughter could be the next in line. The threat remains of violence, of the boogeyman, because Michael wasn't the first killer. Keep in mind, in 1978, when Sam Loomis and the caretaker of the graveyard are walking between the headstones, and he's telling a story about an individual who had a family that he presumably murdered, but he went out to the shed in the middle of dinner, fetched a hacksaw, and then he kissed his wife and his child goodbye, and then he proceeded to, and you never find out what happens, but the presumption is that it wasn't good, and that this predates Michael Myers. So if Michael Myers wasn't the first killer, surely he won't be the last. What determines the right of succession? Obviously, in Michael's case, he started young. But in terms of, say, starting when you're 6 years old versus if you're the granddaughter's age, it's entirely possible for violence to come out at different points in one's life. Laurie Strode at this point is 60 years old, and yet capable of violence that she never quite exhibited to the same degree or intensity that she did when she was a teenager. The mother, that moment of truth, the violence coming out, never occurred until that moment. When will that deciding factor be? What shadow will they see of the shape that causes them to summon up a monster out of themselves in a way that might not be as benign as you might think? These things are never that cut and dry, so we have yet to see, because even if Michael Myers, the man, is dead, fate personified through a specter of violence remains within a space that is infused with death. That specter of death could revive through the violent actions of any individual that we see on screen. Certainly any of the three women. If it's not Laurie, it could be the mother. If it's not the mother, how horrifying would it be for the mother to realize that her daughter has more in common with Michael Myers than you might think, even if they're not related by blood, but through a potential for violence that we all have within us. It's not that people are good or evil, and that the potential for either exists in situations of tension, in spaces that we all share, that are in contest, not just the actions of people within a space, but that the space belongs to whomever, and if that space is threatened, we might behave in ways that horrify us. In any case, guys, that concludes this video on doubles. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked the video, leave a like or a comment in the comment section below. If you want to subscribe to my channel, feel free to do so, and hit the subscription bell to receive all notifications when I release new content. I also have a Patreon, so if you wish to support that, you may do so by following the link below. And until next time, guys, thanks for watching, and take care.